Uh, Happy Halloween. Today's October 31st, 2020. The election's in 3 days. I just filed my ballot. And I hope the people I picked win. I put myself down as the Supreme Court Justice in Oregon because the only person running is the Garrett family, and the Garrett family helped to murder my wife and cover it up on the same day they murdered my attorney, who was on his way to the district attorney's office to file murder charges Halloween day in 2011. It's still an open murder case and unsolved. My holidays, they're not much fun for me. I've had 4 wives, dismembered, raped, and murders on holidays. That's correct. 4 wives dismembered, raped, and murdered on holidays. Christmas, Halloween, on my birthday, July 4th, and another one. Always on a holiday, my wives are dismembered and murdered. I opened a murder case for the one murdered Halloween day. I figure that's the one I can prove in a courtroom. And then the other 3 will fall into place someday. But I don't get much cooperation because police were part of the murders. Happy Halloween. And I'm not dressed up like a cowboy. I just got back from the store, and you got to wear a mask, and this is the kind I wear. And I always wear a cowboy hat because I owned a ranch where my wives were murdered, the Manning Ranch. And today Sean Connery died, and I was just talking with Greg Bowe about Sean Connery and the movie he made called League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. They made it in Kenya before Obama was president, or during Obama's presidency. And in my life, that's not coincidence. I have many actors in my family. The guy that took Sean Connery's place in the movie was the Moore family. And I think it was around 1973. And Oscar Tyler Moore, Mary Tyler Moore's family, I grew up with him. And his wife was murdered at the same time my wife was murdered. His wife was murdered in Graceland, and my wife was murdered on the Virginia border in Johnson City. And then the Moore family was running a hospital where my wife was murdered. After I saved her life, they murdered her a second time on Halloween Day 2011. And I know exactly who did it, but proving it's a whole different story. As they murdered my attorney on his way to the district attorney's office, and police helped murder my wife and cover it up. So it's very hard to prove, and I'll work on it till I die. And eventually it'll all come together. And I'm the history of JFK's murder. And I wanted to talk about a little of that tonight. And I hope Greg Bowe, I'm going to put this up on your site there, Bow and Arrow. So I'll try to do this slow enough and accurate enough so you can understand this history of my life. JFK, before JFK was murdered, I was kidnapped by the Long, the Wallace, the Osborne, the Anderson, the Andrews, and the Hall families, and they used me for sex. They tortured me, used me for sex, and murdered a kid and threw his body in Philadelphia. It's still an unsolved murder today. I was chained to a toilet in Osborne's basement as my family wrote the songs Elvis Presley was singing in Vegas and in his Hollywood movies. And that was people like Mitch Ryder and Detroit Wheels and his bass player, Roy Nevelt, who was my brother-in-law. And then I went to the same school that Mitch Ryder attended. And when I went to to that school in Warren, Michigan. John Kane of Steppenwolf played piano with me. And then Gary Shunk, who plays music in Detroit for people like Aretha Franklin, took John Kane's place at Warren High School. And then he went on to become a pianist at Michigan State University. I believe he taught piano at Michigan State as a professor for quite a few years. And he still plays in Detroit, back up for a lot of jazz bands. Gary always liked jazz. And I used to play drums with Gary at places like Ted's Restaurant as the world got Oprah and Ted Danson. And then I ran Ted's. Ted's was run by another guy named Herbie, and I'm Hugh, which is Hubert. And I worked at Ted's with David Kerr and Megan Terry and Herbie as the world got Ted Danson and Whoopi Goldberg. And I was playing music at the same restaurant with people like Gary Shunk and John Kane. Now, Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald Kennedy was John Fitzgerald Kennedy's mother. And I believe she was born in Boston, Massachusetts, approximately 331 miles from Wilmington, Delaware. And I mentioned Delaware because that's where DuPont's headquarters are. And in my life, DuPont stole my trademark, Bottom Line, to create the WWF. He got sued by the WWF and had to change the name to the WWE. I was murdered, and it took me a couple of years to get back on my feet after arriving at a hospital, DOA. And I didn't have the financial ability or the stamina at that point to sue Mr. DuPont. So he got away with the theft of Bottom Line, and most Americans grew up with the Bottom Line events of Jesse Ventura and Steve Austin and The Rock using my stolen trademark. And then they put up, they turned all the Red Garter bars into Bottom Line clubs all over the globe. London, US, and anybody who made it in the rock and roll industry was using my stolen trademark to do it. The lawyers in California studied out of the Bottom Line booklet to pass the bar exam, the lawyer's bar exam. So people like Kamala Harris, her husband, Mr. Emhoff, who are entertainment lawyers, Barack Obama, Michelle, who were lawyers, all of them studied out of my stolen trademark to pass the bar exam. And that includes Ruth Bader Ginsburg and everybody on the Supreme Court. Garrett, who's running to be the Supreme Court judge here in my state. They all studied out of my stolen trademark, and the senators hide me in all their media, like Graham Media in Detroit, where I was born. They hide my kidnapping. They hide the murders of kids in my family for 20 years, thrown on my properties, the world knows as the Oakland County child killings. And L. Brooks Patterson hid those killings on purpose, even as my family member, Gerald Ford, became president. And Gerald Ford's real name is Gardner and King, and King and Gardner families are my family. He used the name Ford to be your president when he replaced Nixon. And that had to do with Kennedy and his brother's murders also. Getting back to Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, she was born in Boston, Massachusetts. And in my life, I would have gone to Fitzgerald High School if Kennedy hadn't been killed. But on Hughes Street, when they murdered Kennedy, they built Hazel Park High School, and it replaced John Fitzgerald High School. And then they built Baker College next door to that on Hughes Street. And my family owned Hughes Street back then in the 1953 through 1963. That was my family's property, and I'm Hugh. And this isn't coincidence. Kennedy's murder was planned in a college before he was president. The streets in that town in Oakland County have the president's names on the streets running parallel to Hughes Street, which turns into a double street. And then you had Huey Lewis and Billy Squier. Huey Lewis came from Germany. His real name is not Huey. And Billy Squier from Germany, his name was Craig, and that fits into a whole lot of things, the Craig name. And in my life, my business manager, when I started playing music on my own, was David Fitzgerald. And Rose Elizabeth Kennedy, her father was John Francis Fitzgerald. I'm Hugh Francis Squier, and Kennedy and Jackie Bouvier are my cousins. Rose Kennedy was a countess of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. She was appointed a countess of the Holy Roman Catholic Church because of her good deeds there in Boston. The Pope in 1951 made her a countess, which is a royal title in Europe. And Rose Kennedy was the matriarch and a countess of the Kennedy family. Her father was the mayor of Boston. Her mother was Marguerite Delahide, and I grew up next to my Aunt Gardner, Marguerite Gardner, and an Indian girl named Della. In my elementary school in Oakland County. And Della's family is in the Smithsonian now, alongside my family in the Smithsonian. And all of these things are not coincidence. My family's tractors, Massey Ferguson and Harris steam tractors, are next to Jack Ruby's shoes. And Judy Garland's slippers in the Smithsonian. And in Britain, an earl or a duchess was the highest title of nobility in Europe. A duke, an earl, you can't get a title higher than that. So Rose Kennedy had a title that was as high as you could get in the nobility family. It was a title of nobility in Europe. Earl means a man of noble birth or rank. And that's who my business manager at Bottom Line was, David Fitzgerald, from that family and from the Kennedy family. And Gerald Fitzgerald, for example, was the 11th Earl of Kildare, and he was known as the Wizard of Ireland. He was the Earl of Ireland, Gerald Fitzgerald. And then you had Edward Percy Fitzgerald, who was an English poet and author, and he would translate other artists. And he was known as a translator, a poet, and an author, and a very famous person. And that's the Fitzgerald family. And like I said, in 1951, Pope Pius the 12th granted Kennedy the title of Countess in recognition of her exemplary motherhood and her charitable works. In 1992, when she turned 102, the intersection of Wells Avenue and Harley Street in Boston was proclaimed Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Square. And on that same day, Hubert Wells was SWAT teamed while playing cards with me and his daughter in Warren, Michigan, on 9 Mile and Mound at the Chrysler plant there. And Lee Iacocca and his son-in-law were my neighbors at my farm where I stopped the worldwide drug trade. And none of these things are coincidence. The plaque was dedicated to her son, or by her son, not to her son. It was dedicated to her by her son, Senator Edward Kennedy, who was working with me on the Berne Convention at that very same time in sessions of Congress. And at the same time, around the same time, they also named the Rose Kennedy Greenway in Boston, Massachusetts, a park that was created when the city's central artery was sunk below ground level deliberately. That park was named after on July 26, 2004. She always led like things like the grandparents parade at the age of 90, the Special Olympics, and my wife was in the Special Olympics, my murdered wife on the Manning Ranch. And my wife was in a wheelchair, couldn't speak, couldn't walk, and she was dismembered. They cut her ears off, sodomized her, and on Halloween Day 2011, they slit her throat. A gay man slit her throat, and a young woman helped him do it, right in Johnson City, Tennessee, after they had dismembered her and sodomized her in the days leading up to Halloween. At 90, she ran the Special Olympics, and her works are documented in the Oscar-nominated short documentary, Rose Kennedy, A Life to Remember. And all her life, she collected autographs. The longest bridge in the country of Ireland was named after Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. It's called the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Bridge in Ireland. And when my wife was murdered and I moved here to the West Coast on the California northern border, I was at Robin Williams' home 3 minutes before he was murdered. They told you he committed suicide. Robin Williams, his family are my cousins back in Birmingham, Michigan. And I've known the Williams family all my life. Not just Robin Williams, Pam Williams, Jerry Williams, who worked at the tech center, and many other Williams family members. I grew up with them. When Robin Williams died, I was at his house in LA, and I came back up to where I live here on the northern border of California, and I found Mrs. Waldo screaming out to me from her home, and she was laying in a pool of her own blood. And I heard her screaming for help, and I broke into her house and got her to a hospital, but she died 30 days later. And then the Waldo Bridge was renamed the Robin Williams Bridge, just like Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy has a bridge in Ireland named after her. These things in my life aren't coincidence. It's who my family is. JFK was murdered by the very same people who kidnapped me and killed the kids in Oakland County, Michigan. And it's never come to light because all of the murders in my life are unsolved by design. And it's not 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 murders, it's hundreds of murders. Things like on the day Kennedy was killed in Dallas, the Duncan kids were murdered next door to my farm, my family's farm. And Johnson, after taking office, called my family's farm about the murdered Duncan kids, only they didn't call it murder, they called it a terrible accident, which is just a lie. They were murdered. And Mr. Duncan, their father, and the owner of Duncan's Bar and Grill, there across the street from my dad's sister's farm and my Uncle Rose's farm, he was my friend all my life. I went to his funeral and I went to his kid's funeral. And I met with Mr. Rose and Mr. Wells, who I mentioned earlier was SWAT team by the Warren Police Department while playing cards with me at Chrysler's. For no reason, they SWAT teamed him. In my estimation, no reason. They should have got him some help instead of shooting him and killing him in front of his daughter and myself. The marriages in the Kennedy family are all related to me in one way or another. You had Sergeant Sarge Shriver Jr. had five children with Eunice Mary Kennedy, and I went to school with the Shriver family all my life. And then you had the English actor Peter Lawford had 4 children and divorced Patricia Helen Pat Kennedy in 1966 after JFK's murder. And Peter Lawford was asked to join the Rat Pack by my own family member, Frank Sinatra. And you had Peter Lawford and Dean Martin and Joey Bishop and Frank Sinatra. They were the original Rat Pack in Vegas, and that was the Kennedy family. And my cousins have married into the Kennedy family many times. In 1956, my cousin Smith, Stephen Edward Smith, married Jean Ann Kennedy. And in the Matrix, they tell you Smith is the bad person and Anderson is the good person. In my life, Anderson kidnapped me at 4, chained me to a toilet in Governor Osborne's basement with Hall, Long, Wallace, Andrews, Anderson, and they raped me. So in my life, the Smith family were the good people. And I know that because of being chained to a toilet and tortured by men at the age of 4 on Hoover Street in Oakland County. And then they murdered kids around me for the next 20 years of my life, right up until the day the FBI detained me for Jimmy Hoffa's murder in my Troy, Michigan driveway in front of all 5 of my children as I returned home in my work truck. And I lived across the street from the Duff family, which is Duff Trucking. And all of this was hidden by Graham Media, who owns WJR and Channel 4, and Bill Bonds was Channel 7. And I knew all these people, and they're senators and ran your churches. To this day, they hid this in my life with L. Brooks Patterson. So the world never got the truth of JFK's murder. And then you had Edward Moore, and I already mentioned earlier in the video, the Moore family, Oscar Tyler Moore and Mary Tyler Moore and Dick Van Dyke. My family owned the patents on the Chevy van. That was Buckminster Fuller, and that's my family member. The Fuller family is my grandmother, and we make the Fuller transmissions. Well, I grew up with the Moore family. So Edward Moore, or Ted Kennedy, married Joan Benet. And I've said this in other videos. On the day John Benet Ramsey went missing, Mrs. Benet was in my house with my mother. And the Benet family, or Bennett, I like to call them Bennett, like Tony Bennett. The Bennett family, their name is on all the gas station pumps back when they had the dollar signs that rolled and you pulled the handle out and put the tank in. I don't know if the Bennett family is still making the gas pumps, but back then in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they did. All the gas pumps across America were made by the Bennett family. So the Bennett family would have dinner with me as they gave the world Star Trek and Hugh of Borg. And Fuller Transmissions on Borg Warner, and I went to school, and I'm Hugh, so I would venture to say the Bennett family marked me as Hugh of Borg in the Star Trek series. After they murdered all the Kennedys in my life. And there's more to this story. The Hall family married the Kennedy family, and Hall is one of the people who kidnapped me before marrying into the Kennedy family. Schwarzenegger married into the Kennedy family. As one of my author's books was stolen, Sophia Stewart, her stolen book became The Matrix and The Terminator. And my family's name in Europe was Schwartz. Now you have Schwarzenegger, and I grew up in Detroit, and I lived with black families. After my grandmother and her three daughters were murdered with their brother Harold on Clinton River Road, and the world got the Clintons as president. And in my life, these things are not coincidence, but all media denies I exist, and no one will interview me on radio or TV. And Jim Garrison was my history teacher, and I bought the ranch from Mr. Manning as the world got the JFK archives and Bradley Manning when they murdered my wife. And Bradley Manning was just a way to take the generation under me away from thinking of JFK's murder. Whenever they hear the Manning name, now they think of a gay soldier. And this was done on purpose by the Obama White House from Kenya, groomed by the Queen of London, where Sean Connery lived and made his last movie in Kenya, Extraordinary Gentleman, with people in my life like Hyde, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I went to school with the Hyde family. I went to school with the Shriver family, Smith and Bennett, Frank Sinatra, the Rat Pack. These are my relatives. Ava Gardner, Marguerite Gardner at the Gardner Museum. The Gardner family left the only known photographs of Amelia Earhart in the Smithsonian. I'm the real history of your country, and all the news media acts like I don't exist. If I call into talk shows, they hang up on me. I'm not allowed to say hi. I'm Hugh Squier. I own Bottom Line New York. I'm a publisher with ASCAP BMI. I'm never allowed to do that on radio or TV. And yet I'm surrounded by hundreds of unsolved murders like JFK, his brothers, J.J. Kennedy, even the singer who died in Monterey. His name slips my mind right now. John Denver died at Monterey, just same place J.J. Kennedy did, and I know the airline mechanic who murdered them both. And this isn't a pipe dream. He bragged to me about it. But because L. Brooks Patterson and Macomb County and Oakland County police forces have hidden the truth of these murders in my life for 7 decades now, nobody in America knows truth of the murder of JFK, the murder of Hoffa, the murder of the Oakland County kids, who are my family members. Little Timmy King, I'm the King family. I'm the Gardner family. That's Bill Gates' mother. That's Frank Sinatra's mother. But you don't know the truth because I'm never allowed to say who I am or to speak on the news or radio or TV, and nobody in the paper ever prints the truth. In my life, it's one murder after another done by the White House senators and the governors wherever I'm living. And CBS, Tom Garrett destroyed my only income as they murdered my wife and my attorney on Halloween Day 2011. And now Garrett is the Supreme Court judge here in Oregon. He's the only person that applied for the job here in Oregon. So now if I go to a court here, the very person who dismembered and murdered my wife and attorney will be the judge, the very same family. And my whole life is like that. And I'm never allowed on the news. CBS, instead of killing my wives and attorneys, they should be interviewing me and telling American citizens the truth of America, but they never do. They go from one cover up to another. And then Fox News uses my stolen trademark, and CNN is Anderson Cooper. Anderson raped me, Cooper raped my daughter, and Anderson Cooper 360, his mother knew my family. She knew the Gardner family, and she took Elon Musk from Canada. His mother took over the cover of Maybelline as my fiance was murdered Christmas Day. Kiki Nelson. Kiki was murdered. Her sister was the cover of Maybelline magazine, and I'm the line, maybe line. Johnny Cash was walking me, and Elon Musk, May Musk, took over the cover of Maybelline on that day. And then she had Elon, and now you have electric cars from Elon Musk. And my whole life is like this. In America, you're not getting any truth. You're not getting truth from any of your truthers. They're all liars, hiding my truth. Alex Jones and Jesse Ventura are not truth. They use me, my likeness, my trademark bottom line, my name Huey Francis Squier, Huey Lewis in the News, Billy Squier, the Pope. Billy Squier, his real name is Craig. Craig is chief of police in Detroit. And the Craig family are other things right here where I live that you would know. And I'm not going to go into that in this video. But my Halloween is real spooky because I watched a woman I took care of for 30 years who couldn't talk, was in a wheelchair, and she was Jerry Lewis's poster girl. I watched him dismember, sodomize her, cut her ears off, and then slit her throat Halloween Day. And her son's names are Michael and Freddie. And you have Halloween movies, Michael Myers and Freddie. I'm back. This is my Halloween. Thanks to the American media that's stolen my birth name, my trademark, kidnapped my children, murdered kids all around me, murdered Jimmy Hoffa, murdered the Kennedy family, and they're all marking me and they pretend I don't exist, and I'm still here. I've been DOA to hospitals 3 times, and I post these videos right to the FBI that the sex crime division is run by the very family that kidnapped me at 4, the Osborne family. The Osborne family also does a TV series about murders of children and kidnaps of children and unsolved murders. And they kidnapped me and murdered kids in my neighborhood off of Hoover Street. And I don't think it. I know it. I lived on Hoover Street. I was kidnapped by the Osborne family, chained to a toilet. The Hall family, the Anderson family, the Long and the Wallace family were there, and they raped me. I remember being raped, and you can't forget that when men stick their things in your mouth and your other appendages and threaten to chop your hands off and beat you, and you're 4 years old. You don't forget these people. And that's who runs your FBI sex crime division, that same family. I get no help from them when I call about murdered kids. They hang up on me, and they've done it all my life. L. Brooks Patterson did it in Oakland County. Sheriff Hackle did it in Macomb County when they murdered Judge Hunter D. Stair, the man who gave me custody of my kids. And they murdered, when my daughter was kidnapped, I got her a doctor, Dr. James Brandenburg. They murdered him 5 minutes after I left his office with my daughter. And Sheriff Hackle covered up those murders in the next county from Oakland County. And they were murdered at Selfridge Air National Guard, who protects New York airspace, where they blew up the Twin Towers that held the receipts to my stolen trademark bottom line. It was $2 trillion in entertainment contracts. They had to hide the theft. The receipts were in the Twin Towers. Very few Americans died there. The offices were filled with foreigners from foreign countries. I had a worldwide publishing company called Bottom Line, at the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers /BMI. In London and Canada, I used Astra. London, I used Stationers Hall. And gee, they stole my trademark and it became the bars for Red Garters after they murdered my fiance and wives. Then you had a man from France and a man from Germany steal my first and last name, Billy and Craig. And I'm never going to stop saying this truth. Like, I'm sorry, nobody ever spreads my videos. They're truth. And I'm related to many presidents, and I grew up with Hamilton, Lincoln, Chase, Morgan. I'm the Harris family. And everybody I knew was on your American money because they're my family members. And we wrote the Declaration of Independence. And then my family members were put on all the money when they created that Federal Reserve, that awful Federal Reserve everybody hates. I was born and my family members are on all your money. And Donald Trump borrowed money from all my family's banks, never paid it back. And now you have Kamala M. From India stealing the American Harris name so she can be your vice president. And they're doing that right now with Joe Biden. And Joe lives with my brother's wife. He was having sex with her behind his back for 30 years as my brother was married to her. None of this is coincidence. American media is run by the senators in the Senate and by the Queen of England and by Swiss banks. The reason I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Delaware, is because that was where the first polar explorer, he explored there in 1609, Henry. And I'm trying to remember his full name. And I can't. But in 1609, Henry was the polar explorer. And for the London Queen, I believe, or no, it was the Danish Queen, King and Queen. He was an Arctic explorer and he went into Delaware trying to find a passage to the Indies, an Arctic passage to the Indies. And boy, was he ever off. He sailed up that river in Delaware, and they called it the Arctic Circle back then. In my lifetime, the Byrd family, the Arctic polar explorer, Admiral Byrd, he's my family member. And everything in between Delaware in 1609 and California here where I live now with the theft of Bottom Line and my name, Hugh Francis Squier. Worldwide, this was worldwide theft. And then you fought 9/11 over the theft, and they didn't tell you that truth. Every senator in the country knew me until the day after 9/11, and then none of them knew me. And I can prove this, and I have many times. I have handwritten letters from senators, every senator in the country, right up until 9/11. And then all of a sudden, nobody knew me, and I'm not allowed to speak on the news. So I'm speaking here on Facebook, and I'll continue to speak here on Facebook and write books. And I'll make movies if I ever get the funding to do that. And I'll tell the real history of the country that the rest of the presidents in the country don't tell. And America is being taken over by Europe, by the Queen, by the London throne. Kenya, President Obama, Kenya, Sean Connery, Kenya, James Bond in your White House, right from the London throne. Obama, Michelle, studying out of my stolen trademark. And now you have Kamala M. using the Harris name to get in the White House. And people are are seriously considering putting a family of slave traders in the White House. And that's not my family. That's not the real American Harris family. I'm going to end this video here. I stopped Henry's drugs. And the reason I mentioned Henry the Polar Explorer is because they found a ship under the Twin Towers when they destroyed my receipts and my FBI documents in Building 7 pertaining to James Hoffa. And bottom line, Henry the Explorer, he worked for the Hudson Bay Company. And you got Hudson's, and under the Twin Towers, there was a boat from the Hudson Bay country, a Hudson Bay Company. Underneath the Twin Towers, they found it when they excavated the dust away. They found this ship from the Hudson Bay Company. Who was Henry Fitzgerald, the explorer? It's just unbelievable, my life. And in my lifetime, when I stopped Noriega's drugs on my farm, Henry Bowe was running the drugs with Bucky Larson. And you got a movie, Henry and Bucky, Bucky never even went to jail. They made him a movie star, Born to be a Star, Bucky Larson. And Hank went to jail for 5 minutes. And because I stopped kids from getting LSD, cocaine, marijuana, and assorted amphetamines from a real pharmacist in Utica, Michigan, I went to jail for a year. 1 year, because I stopped his illegal gun and drug trade on the back of my farm, run by Robert Tosh Plumley and Kiki Camarino, as my fiance Kiki was murdered Christmas Day. There's a real movie called Bucky Larson, Born to be a Star. He lived on the back of my farm in one of the worker houses in Utica, Michigan. Bucky Larson. I stopped his drug trade with Marsha Blanchard, Bobby Brooks, Henry Bowe, Mr. and Mrs. Giles. And there's no lie in this, but you've never heard it on the news because I don't exist. And they stole my trademark, my business, my life, murdered the kids in my family, murdered my wives, and it's never been on the news and nobody's in jail. And these murders go back 7 decades, all the way back to 1953. And I'm going to end this here. Happy Halloween. And this isn't a make-believe story. This is my real life. Bye.